Hear me? Yes. Everyone knows how I like the mic. So, the moving man set down the last box in Mrs. Moskowitz's new apartment and wiped his brow. "That's it, ma'am," he said. "Enjoy your new home." Mrs. Moskowitz let her cat out of his box. "You call this home, Fred?" She walked through the kitchen and the bedroom and back to the living room. "I miss my old house," she said as she sat down. "I miss the flowers in the front. I miss the porch in the back. I miss the old bathtub where I used to watch Sophie and Sam when they were small. This apartment will never be home." When Mrs. Moskowitz's son came by that evening, the boxes were still not unpacked. Sam kissed his mother and handed her a package. "I found this in the basement when I was locking up the old house, Mother. You must have forgotten it." Mrs. Moskowitz shook the box. Then she opened the lid and took out a sack made of soft cloth. She untied the sack and pulled the 2 tarnished candlesticks out. "My Shabbat candlesticks! When you were little, Sam, I polished these until you could see yourself in the reflection. For Shabbat, I cleaned the whole house till it sparkled." Sam, remember how good the freshly baked olives smelled? Remember the laughing and singing after supper? Remember how happy we were? "Yes," Sam said, "I remember." Mrs. Moskowitz shook her head. "What memories, Sam? What memories?" The next morning, you gonna kiss her goodbye? I know, you pulled out, you need to say. The next morning, when Mrs. Moskowitz pulled back the curtains, a ray of sunlight struck the candlesticks. "Look at that, Fred. Aren't they lovely?" Mrs. Moskowitz did her marketing. Oh, when she did her marketing, sorry. She dropped a jar of silver polish in her basket. After lunch, Mrs. Moskowitz polished the candlesticks. She held Fred up to them. "Can you see yourself, Fred?" Then she frowned. "It's that table. How can I put my beautiful candlesticks on such a plain table?" Mrs. Moskowitz climbed around the many boxes. She tugged at the top flap of the biggest box until it sprang open. She pulled out sheets, blankets, and a fluffy comforter. But she didn't find what she was looking for. "Oh, Fred, where could it be?" Mrs. Moskowitz muttered as she tucked her comforter into the bed. She rummaged around in the box again. "It's here somewhere. I know it's here." Mrs. Moskowitz pulled out a white tablecloth. And she was so happy. She shook out the tablecloth and laid it on the table. "Fred, come look. It's magnificent." "But Fred," she said, "how could such beautiful candlesticks on such a lovely table stand on such a filthy floor? Where did I put my mop?" Where's Stu? Louise wants you to take a picture of this, Stu.
Right, yeah, because this is the only toilet.
Mrs. Moskowitz unpacked one box after another and finally found her bucket and mop. She scrubbed and mopped the living room floor, the bedroom floor, and then she cleaned the kitchen. She washed the cabinet. She polished the furniture and pushed it into place. Mrs. Are you ready? I'm ready. Mrs. Moskowitz rubbed her back. "What those candlesticks are putting me through," she groaned. Then she yawned and turned out the light. In the morning, Mrs. Moskowitz got up early. She watched the light playing on the candlesticks as she brushed her hair. "What this table needs is a bunch of flowers, don't you think, Fred?" Mrs. Moskowitz put on her hat and coat and walked to the corner. She went into the flower shop and bought a bunch of posies and daisies. On her way home, she stopped at the grocery store. She bought flour, eggs, yeast, and a box of long white candles. At another store, she bought a tall bottle of red wine. When she got home, Mrs. Moskowitz unpacked her groceries. A table with Shabbat candlesticks, a beautiful tablecloth, and such lovely flowers. It's still missing one thing. Mrs. Still doing it now. Okay. Mrs. Moskowitz found her old tin recipe box and pulled out a worn card. "Freshly baked challah, that's what we need." Mrs. Moskowitz sifted and stirred and kneaded the dough. Then she rolled it into 3 long braids and braided them together. As she worked, Mrs. Moskowitz thought about baking challah. With her mother many years ago, she thought about raising her family in the old house, and she thought about the years still to come. Mrs. Moskowitz put the 2 loaves of challah in a dish and put them aside to rise. Then she wiped her hands on her apron. "Just one more thing, Fred." Mrs. Moskowitz went to the phone and called her son. "Come over tonight, Sam, and bring the family. We'll light the candles and have a Shabbat meal. I'll call Sophie and invite her too." Then Mrs. Moskowitz laid down for a nap. Just before sundown, Sam and his family arrived at the door.
Mom!
"Shabbat Shalom," Sam said as he walked in. "Why, Mother, look at this apartment." Mrs. Moskowitz picked up Fred. She looked around. The boxes were all unpacked. Everything was clean and in place. The candlesticks stood shining on the table. The apartment looked beautiful, and here was the family to celebrate. Mrs. Moskowitz laughed. "Fred, when did all of this happen?" Mrs. Moskowitz turned to her family. "Shabbat Shalom," she said, "and welcome to my new home."
Aww.
Thanks to Louise and Amy.